Chen Zi'ang, Ganyu number 29. The year 687 is coming to a close. In the western mountains, men labor at warfare. Hampered by provisions, they circuit the road of Chong. Halberds over shoulders strike fear in barbarian cities. The dead of winter, the shrouding fog is heavy. From empty caves, oozing clouds appear. A gloom so heavy you can't tell day from night. Yet again and again, dispatches call them to arms. Clamber and crouch over 1,000-yard drops. Tumble from sheer places, rushing into deepest blackness. Scattered in confusion among peaks and gorges, they lament, marching through ice and snow. Our sage ruler steers the universe, and I've heard the great stair is level. The great lords, the meat-eaters, have fouled up in their plans, and those who live on greens must go on far campaigns. We have here yet another of the poems of the Ganyu. Now, in the last few days, we've mentioned how Chen Zi'ang represents probably the most important of the early Tang poets who tried to fight against, who rejected the dominant style in their time, which was the court poetry. And Ganyu and Chen Zi'ang's poems in the Ganyu represent very well the sort of opposition poetics that rejected a view of poetry as some sort of refined aesthetic, courtly entertainment with certain very fixed patterns of diction, of form, of subject matter, of images, and so on and so forth. And he represented a move back, and he was among the most successful, to the poetry of the past. There's this fugu strain in the opposition poetics of the early Tang, as Stephen Owen tells us. And, these references of his, which are the poetry of the Han and the Wei, were examples of poetry that was very expressive, quite direct at expressing emotions, especially infused with a Confucian moral seriousness. The idea that poetry should not be mainly used for singing flattering, sugared words to the emperor or describing amusing banquets of the aristocracy and the pleasures of the gilded youth. No, poetry should be used for serious matters, including political criticism of the emperor or the ruling elite, and the exposing of moral principles. Now, we've talked a lot about court poetry. One of its main characteristics, formally speaking, as Stephen Owen explains in the Poetry of the Early Tang, is that it follows generally a very fixed structure. And this structure generally begins with a first couplet that sets the scene in space and in time. Then we have the middle couplets, which are a series of parallelistic couplets which describe the scene, or if it's a poem about a party in a garden, well, it describes the landscape, and it describes the different food and drink and the different pleasures of music and dancing and whatever. And the poem generally concludes, the last couplet in a traditional court poem concludes with this praise of this expression of feelings, which are generally either praise of the emperor or of the person who hosted the party, lament or sadness at having to quit the party, and so on. So all very decorous, very elegant, and very rigid. Now, Chen Zi'ang tried in a lot of his Ganyu poems to break radically from the tripartite form, but it seems that some of his efforts here were rather mechanical and artificial, and rather paradoxically, in this poem that we have just read, he follows the tripartite form, but he changes its contents partially, and this helps to produce a rather successful poem. So let's talk about this poem then. 687. This poem is, the topic is not the typical court poem topic. So this is about a campaign in the west in Sichuan, which is actually the area from which Chen Zi'ang had come, the old region of Shu. There's a military campaign against barbarians in this region, and so this is not the typical banqueting celebratory poems. It expresses a moral stand on a topic of contemporary concern. So, yeah, the topic of the poem, therefore, is a description of a military campaign, of the suffering of the soldiers who have to campaign in the winter and in the harsh landscape of Shu, which is full of mountains. And it ends up with a strong criticism of the elite, of the rich, who have pushed for this campaign and probably are mismanaging it, while the people, the conscripts, the poor, have to suffer. And probably indirectly, this is a criticism of the ruler for engaging in such a campaign unnecessarily, probably. Okay, let's dissect it as we usually do, couplet by couplet. First couplet. The year 687 is coming to a close. In the western mountains, men labor at warfare. So as usual, the first couplet denotes the scene. So we have in the first line the year, in the second line the place and the activity. It's the end of 687, therefore it's winter. Not only do we know the year, we know that it's winter because the year is ending. Remember, in the traditional Chinese calendar, the 3 last months of the year were the winter months, and the first month of the next year would correspond approximately to our early spring, late winter, early spring, maybe March. So this is late in the year, so this is January, February. And the western mountains, that is in the region of Shu, men have to fight. They have to devote themselves to warfare. And I think winter is not the typical season for warfare either. So that will make the campaign doubly harsh from what might usually be expected. So the first couplet summarizes most of the story. Now the parallelistic couplets in the middle are going to give us views of the situation, but rather than the typical parallel couplets and a physical description of the scene, what Chen Zi'ang is going to do is couplets that are more likely arranged in a narrative order. So in a way, they're still setting the scene, but they're setting it by telling a story. This sort of narrative poetry was very typical of ballads and more typical of, as we said, the Han Wei style of poetry, the Fugu style, the old style of poetry. Okay, so second couplet. Hampered by provisions, they circuit the road of Qiong. Halberds over shoulders, strike fear in barbarian cities. So we get the first image. Well, how is the warfare taking place? Well, the soldiers are moving around with provisions. They follow these mountain roads in the barbarian lands, and they're carrying their weapons. Halberds, the very typical traditional Chinese weapon. I'm not sure it was that much employed by the Tang, but it's always a fancy word for the weapons of the soldiers. Next couplet. The dead of winter. The shrouding fog is heavy. From empty caves, oozing clouds appear. So this is a cold winter landscape. So the soldiers are marching onwards. What are they encountering? Well, the barbarians are not explicitly mentioned, but the harsh landscape is, and it's defined by two elements: fogs and clouds, and among which ooze from the caves. So there's this indistinct, hardly visible, rather invisible realm in which the soldiers have to walk carefully, probably stumbling, not seeing, experiencing the cold and experiencing this lack of vision. And this creates probably a melancholy and sad feeling on the troops. If it were not bad enough that they're on a campaign, they're in this unreal realm of mountains and mists where nothing can be seen. A gloom, next couplet, a gloom so heavy you can't tell day from night. Yet again and again, dispatches call them to arms. So they're living, these soldiers, in this unreal domain, in this horrible, cold, rugged terrain where the density of mists and clouds hardly allows one to distinguish night from day, and yet more soldiers have to come, and the campaign keeps going on and on. Clamber and crouch over 1,000-yard drops. tumble from sheer places, rushing into deepest blackness. Remember, this area is a mountainous terrain, and this is what this couplet illuminates. Like the soldiers are not only working in near blind conditions through these mountain passages. They're dangerous places where one can very easily slip and fall to one's death. You're climbing through really, really high mountains. You can see tremendous falls left and right, I imagine, and deep, so deep and so big are the falls. Only blackness, like a black gulf or like an opening mouth of hell, seems to be the place one can see at the bottom of these very high elevations. Deepest blackness. Next couplet. Scattered in confusion among peaks and gorges, they lament, marching through ice and snow. So this is the last of or close to the end of the descriptive couplets of the campaign. In a way, it connects with the second couplet, which, or even with the second line. So there we have the soldiers marching in. We finish this descriptive section with the soldiers marching again. This time they are lamenting through the ice and snow, and through these mountains they are dispersed. So we finish with this image of the soldiers suffering, dispersed and cold. The last two couplets move us from the descriptive to, traditionally they would move us to the feelings of the person, to gracious compliments or polite regrets at the close of a banquet. But here we have, even though the tripartite structure is respected, and these last couplets contain an internal response by the poem, the response is a political one. It's the typical traditional Confucian one, in this case, indignant criticism of the government. But this is still the message of the poem. So even though many things have changed from the structure of a traditional court poem, the tripartite structure and even the essence of that structure has been preserved. So in this couplet, our sage ruler steers the universe, and I've heard the great stair is level. So we move from the mountainous region and the war to the capital. And of course, it has a bit of ham-fisted flattery, as where Chinese poets were limited in how much they could directly accuse the emperor in a poem. So the emperor or empress, because it must be Empress Wu, is not directly censured. On the contrary, there's this indirect praise, like the sage ruler rules the world. The great stair is level. The great stair is a constellation, and here it symbolizes the imperial social order. That it is level indicates that the world should be in order and at peace, which it is not. So there is a contrast between what should be or what is stated in the couplet and what really is. And finally, the last couplet directs criticism and pushes it slightly away, perhaps, from the empress to the aristocrats, the noblemen, the high courtiers, whose lives of ease are contrasted with the lives of hardship of the common people, who are the ones that fight the wars. The great lords, the meat eaters, have fouled up in their plans, and those who live on greens must go on far campaigns. Contrast the people who eat meat, the noblemen, the people who eat plants and vegetables, the common people. So, because of these wicked, incompetent great lords, the war is taking place. So, criticism is being deflected from the empress, but only indirectly, because, in the last instance, the empress is the one who is responsible for giving orders. But anyway, quite an interesting poem by Chen.